Imagine waking up in complete darkness. Your wrists are chained. A strange metallic hum echoes in the room. Then, a tape recorder begins to play. A man's calm, chilling voice explains exactly how he will torture you, piece by piece. You realize this isn't a nightmare. It's real. And the man speaking is David Parker Ray, known as the Toy Box Killer. David Parker Ray is one of the most disturbing criminals in American history, a man whose crimes were so grotesque that the FBI called his torture chamber the Toy Box. But unlike other serial killers, Ray wasn't driven by rage or impulse. His actions were carefully calculated. He turned cruelty into ritual, transforming an ordinary trailer into a place that rivaled horror movies in its depravity. What makes his story even darker is that no bodies were ever officially recovered, even though investigators believe his victims number in the dozens. His crimes remain some of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico, David Parker Ray's childhood was marked by abuse, neglect, and an obsession with domination. His father was an alcoholic who beat him regularly, while his mother abandoned him at a young age. Raised by his strict grandfather, Ray became isolated and withdrawn. But beneath the surface, a dangerous obsession began to take root. As a teenager, Ray developed a fascination with sadomasochism, bondage, and violent sexual fantasies. He collected pornography depicting torture and deviance, filling notebooks with drawings of women bound and gagged. By adulthood, these fantasies had metastasized into something much darker, an obsession he would later bring to life in horrifying ways. Ray's tool of terror was a motorhome trailer parked in the dusty town of Elephant Butte, New Mexico. But inside, it wasn't a place of travel or comfort. It was a dungeon, meticulously designed for one purpose: torture. The FBI would later describe the trailer as one of the most elaborate torture chambers they had ever seen. It was soundproofed and filled with nightmarish devices: whips, chains, pulleys, and clamps, surgical instruments, saws, and scalpels, a gynecological chair with straps, homemade electrocution devices, and a large wooden box, coffin-like, where victims could be locked away in complete darkness. Mounted on the walls were countless diagrams of women in bondage. There were also numerous sex toys, modified for pain rather than pleasure. And perhaps most chilling of all was the recorded audio tape Ray played for every victim at the start of their ordeal. When a woman awoke in the trailer, the first thing she would hear was a cassette player. On the tape was David Parker Ray's voice, cold and methodical, detailing in graphic detail everything that would happen to her. "Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wriggling around and wondering what's going to happen next? Well, you're very lucky. You're not dead. Yet." The tape went on for over 30 minutes, describing the torture, sexual assault, and psychological torment she was about to endure. He left nothing to the imagination. By the time the recording ended, the victim knew exactly what was coming, and that hopelessness was part of the torture itself. Ray rarely worked alone. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, and occasionally his daughter, were complicit in luring victims. They would pick up women, often sex workers or runaways, drug them and bring them back to the trailer. The victims were chained, blindfolded, and stripped of their identities. For days, sometimes weeks, they were subjected to sadistic rituals inside the toy box. When Ray was finished, he would drug them with powerful sedatives, erase their memory as much as possible, and release them in remote areas, terrified, disoriented, and often doubting their own sanity. This method allowed him to continue his crimes for years without drawing suspicion. Many victims likely never came forward, fearing no one would believe them, or not even remembering enough to explain. Ray's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, if not for the bravery of one woman. In March 1999, Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old sex worker, was approached by Ray and his accomplice posing as undercover cops. They handcuffed her and dragged her to the trailer. For 3 days she was tortured, assaulted, and chained inside the toy box. But Cynthia was not broken. When Ray left for work, his accomplice, Cindy Hendy, accidentally left the keys to the chains nearby. Seizing her chance, Cynthia managed to unlock herself, stab Hendy with an ice pick, and flee, completely naked, wearing only a dog collar and padlocked chains. Bleeding and terrified, she ran through the streets of Elephant Butte until she found help at a nearby mobile home. Her escape blew the lid off Ray's sadistic empire. Police raided Ray's property and were stunned by what they found. The toy box was worse than any nightmare, a dungeon of horrors that looked like it had been lifted straight out of a sadistic horror movie. Among the discoveries were over 400 pieces of evidence of torture instruments, diaries spanning 40 years, detailing his abductions and assaults, the infamous tape of terror. Investigators believed Ray may have killed as many as 60 women over 3 decades. However, without bodies, proving murder was nearly impossible. The chilling truth: Ray's victims were often women society overlooked, sex workers, runaways, addicts. Many of them vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. Ray allegedly disposed of bodies in Elephant Butte Lake and buried others in the desert. But despite extensive searches, no remains were conclusively identified. The horrifying possibility remains that dozens of families never learned the fate of their missing daughters and sisters, their disappearances forever linked to the toy box killer's sadistic rituals. David Parker Ray was arrested in 1999, along with his girlfriend Cindy Hendy and others who had aided him. Despite the mountain of evidence, the absence of physical bodies weakened the case. He was eventually convicted of kidnapping and torture, sentenced to 224 years in prison. Cindy Hendy received a 36-year sentence for her role in the crimes. But Ray himself never faced full justice. In 2002, just 3 years into his sentence, he suffered a fatal heart attack in prison. He died without ever revealing the location of his victims' bodies, taking those dark secrets to his grave. The case of David Parker Ray lingers in the annals of true crime as one of the most terrifying ever recorded. Unlike many serial killers, his crimes were not about killing swiftly. They were about prolonged suffering, psychological destruction, and domination. What makes the toy box killer especially haunting is the possibility that there are still unidentified victims, women who vanished without explanation, their final days spent in unimaginable torment inside a trailer of nightmares. Even today, the FBI considers the toy box case open, hoping that someday more evidence or remains will surface. Until then, the toy box killer remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the ones in movies, but the ones living quietly in small towns, hiding their horrors behind locked doors. David Parker Ray called his trailer a toy box. But for his victims, it was nothing short of hell on earth. The true number of lives he destroyed may never be known, and that is perhaps the most disturbing part of all. Evil can hide in plain sight, leaving behind nothing but whispers of the suffering it caused. Under the gray skies of Bavaria in 1922, a farmstead named Hinterkaifeck stood in chilling isolation. It was the kind of place that whispered of secrets, with thick woods pressing close and neighbors living miles away. To the outside world, it was simply a rural home. But what happened within those walls would become one of Germany's darkest mysteries, one that has haunted investigators, historians, and true crime followers for over a century. The Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved to this day, a brutal massacre so strange that even now it feels like stepping into the pages of a Gothic horror tale. The story begins with the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, a stern man in his 60s, lived with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. On the surface, it was a family working the land, tending livestock, and living a quiet life. But beneath this seemingly simple exterior lay rumors of dysfunction, scandal, and tension. Andreas was known in the village as a harsh and unfriendly man, and the relationship between him and Victoria was clouded by whispers of abuse and even incest. Victoria's young son Joseph was rumored to be the product of this disturbing relationship, though others believed the father was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had once pursued Victoria romantically. In such a small community, gossip spread quickly, and the family's isolation only made them stranger in the eyes of others. Then came the unsettling signs. A few days before the murders, Andreas complained to neighbors that he had found strange footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but none leading back. Doors had been mysteriously unlocked, and the family's keys went missing. At night, Andreas heard footsteps in the attic, yet when he searched, nothing was there. Victoria told friends that the farm felt cursed, that something was watching them. No one could explain these incidents, and life went on, though with an undercurrent of dread. It was as if the farm itself was warning them of what was to come. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, the killer struck. One by one, the family members were lured to the barn. Investigators later believed that Andreas was the first to step into the darkness, perhaps hearing a noise among the cattle. He was attacked with a mattock, a farming tool with a sharp blade used for chopping. His skull was crushed with brutal force. Cecilia, his wife, followed, then Victoria, and finally the little girl, who was only 7 years old. Each of them was slaughtered the same way, their bodies stacked atop each other, partially covered with hay as though the murderer wanted to hide them but not too carefully. The horror did not end there. After the killings in the barn, the murderer entered the farmhouse. 2-year-old Joseph was bludgeoned to death in his crib, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had just started her job that very day, was murdered in her bed. The brutality was merciless, the strikes deliberate, as if the killer was not only eliminating the family but extinguishing every trace of life in the home. What makes this case even more unsettling is what happened afterward. For days, no one realized the Grubers were dead. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney, livestock fed, and meals prepared in the kitchen. It became clear that the killer had not left immediately after the murders. Instead, they stayed on the farm for several days, eating food, milking cows, and sleeping in the beds of their victims. Imagine the eerie sight of smoke curling into the Bavarian sky, neighbors passing by with the belief that life continued as usual, while in truth, the entire family lay dead in the barn and inside the farmhouse. Suspicion grew when young Cecilia failed to appear at school and Victoria missed church choir practice. Mail began piling up, and neighbors decided to investigate. On April 4th, nearly 4 days after the murders, a group entered the property and stumbled upon the blood-soaked barn. The scene was grotesque. Flies buzzed around the decomposing bodies and the silence of the farm was thick with dread. The discovery sent shockwaves through the village. News spread quickly, and soon investigators swarmed the property, though their methods were far from modern. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately by curious villagers and police officers with little training in forensic work. The investigation uncovered strange details that only deepened the mystery. The murder weapon, the mattock, was found hidden in the attic months later, suggesting the killer had placed it there deliberately. The family dog had been left alive, though he had been tied up and appeared agitated, barking at strangers. Food was missing from the pantry, indicating the murderer had helped themselves during their stay. But most chilling of all were the little details that suggested control and calculation. The barn door was carefully closed, hay stacked over the bodies and windows covered from within, as though someone wanted the farm to appear normal from the outside. Theories about who committed the murders exploded across Bavaria. Some suspected vagrants or passing thieves, but nothing of value was taken from the house. Others believed it was a personal vendetta. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Victoria's neighbor and rumored lover, quickly became a prime suspect. He had quarreled with the family in the past over Joseph's paternity, and his behavior after the murders raised eyebrows. When he joined neighbors in discovering the bodies, he displayed a disturbing calm, even handling the corpses without hesitation. He also had knowledge of the property's layout, fueling suspicions that he could have been the one hiding in the attic before the murders. Yet despite extensive questioning, no evidence directly tied him to the crime. Another theory suggested multiple killers. The murders were executed with such precision and silence that some believed one person could not have subdued the entire family without assistance. Others whispered of supernatural forces, convinced that the strange noises and missing keys before the murders were signs of a haunting. The story of Hinterkaifeck took on a life of its own. becoming part of local folklore, a crime too bizarre to feel entirely human. What continues to haunt investigators is the motive. The killings were excessively brutal, but lacked the usual signatures of robbery or revenge. The staying behind, living in the house with the dead, feels like the act of someone who wanted to possess the family, to consume their lives as his own. It was as if the murderer erased their existence but couldn't quite let go, clinging to the ordinary routines of their home, as though stepping into their roles for a few final days. The official investigation dragged on for years, questioning hundreds of suspects, but no one was ever convicted. Generations of detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths have tried to solve the puzzle, but every lead ends in shadows. Even modern DNA testing brought no breakthrough. The samples were too degraded by time. Hinterkaifeck remains one of the most infamous cold cases in history, its secrets buried beneath layers of speculation and silence. Standing in the ruins of the farm, which was demolished in the years after the murders, one can imagine the uneasy quiet of that isolated land, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant sound of cattle, and the knowledge that once, a family was obliterated there without mercy. The farm is gone, but the story lingers, told and retold in hushed tones. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so disturbing isn't just the brutality, it's the lingering mystery. The killer was never found. The motive was never explained. The bizarre details, from the attic noises to the post-murder meals, refuse to align into a neat narrative. It is a story with jagged edges, one that cuts every time it is told. Even now, more than a century later, people continue to debate theories. Was it Schlittenbauer, unable to accept Victoria's rejection? Was it a wandering killer who vanished into the woods, never to be caught? Or was it someone who knew the family intimately, harboring a grudge so deep it culminated in bloodshed? The truth may never be known, but the unanswered questions are what make the case so haunting. Hinterkaifeck endures not just as a murder mystery, but as a dark parable of isolation, fear, and the shadows that dwell at the edges of human life. When you think of the Gruber's last days, the footsteps in the attic, the missing keys, the feeling of being watched, it is easy to imagine their growing dread. And then when the murders came, they arrived not as a storm but as a silent shadow in the barn, ending everything in a matter of moments. The farm is gone, but the echoes remain. The story of Hinterkaifeck is a reminder that some crimes defy explanation, that evil does not always leave a clear trail. Sometimes it lingers in the silence of unsolved mysteries, leaving us to wonder what kind of monster could slaughter a family and then live among their ghosts. It is that absence of answers, that chilling unknown, which ensures the Hinterkaifeck murders will continue to haunt us for generations to come. In late 1988, in a quiet Tokyo suburb, a nightmare began that would come to be known as one of the most horrifying crimes in Japanese history. 17-year-old Junko Furuta was an ordinary high school student. She was bright, popular, and like many teenagers her age, she dreamed of her future. Her life should have been filled with the simple joys of youth, school, friends, family, and the anticipation of adulthood. Instead, her final days became an unspeakable ordeal that lasted 44 days and ended in one of the cruelest murders the world has ever seen. On November 25, 1988, Junko was walking home from her part-time job when she was spotted by a group of teenage boys. These were not ordinary boys. They were delinquents, already involved in petty crimes, violence, and gang activity. Among them was Hiroshi Miyano, a local bully with ties to the Yakuza. Miyano approached Junko and pretended to be friendly, but he had already planned something sinister. He and his friends decided to abduct her, knowing that their gang connections would likely shield them from serious consequences. They lured her into their trap under false pretenses, pretending to walk her home. Instead, she was forced into a warehouse, then taken to the house of one of the boys' parents. What followed was 44 days of relentless torture and degradation. Junko was held captive in a suburban home, only feet away from the parents of one of her tormentors. The parents, out of fear of the Yakuza connections, turned a blind eye. Neighbors heard noises, even screams, but dismissed them. The horror continued unchecked. From the very first day, the torture was unthinkable. She was repeatedly beaten, raped, and humiliated. Her captors forced her to strip naked and subjected her to unimaginable acts of violence. She was starved, forced to eat cockroaches, and made to drink her own urine. They hung her from the ceiling as a punching bag, crushed her fingers with weights, and burned her skin with cigarettes and lighters. At one point, fireworks were inserted into her body and ignited. Her suffering defies belief, as though her captors were inventing new forms of cruelty with each passing day. Junko's ordeal was not hidden in darkness. Over 100 people, including other teenagers and acquaintances of her captors, were aware of her captivity. Some even visited the house while she was imprisoned, yet no one stepped forward to help her. Whether out of fear, apathy, or complicity, they allowed the torture to continue. The silence of so many stands as one of the most chilling aspects of the case. How an entire community could ignore the screams of a young girl being destroyed before their eyes. As the weeks dragged on, her body began to deteriorate under the constant abuse. Her legs became crippled from repeated beatings, making it impossible for her to walk. She begged her captors to kill her and end the suffering, but they refused. Instead, they escalated the cruelty. They cut off parts of her body, inserted foreign objects into her, and poured hot wax and candle flames onto her skin. At times, they forced her to sleep outside in freezing temperatures, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Despite the unimaginable torment, there were moments when Junko's humanity broke through the darkness. She once asked for water, only to be given her own urine. She begged for mercy but was laughed at. Even as her body weakened, she clung to survival. Her resilience makes her suffering even more heartbreaking, because for 44 days, she endured what no one should ever endure. On the 44th day, in early January 1989, Junko's captors inflicted a final round of torture that would end her life. They beat her with an iron barbell, set her legs on fire, and dropped dumbbells onto her stomach. Her body finally gave out. She collapsed and never regained consciousness. When they realized she was dead, they panicked. Rather than confess, they stuffed her mutilated body into a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and abandoned it as though discarding trash. It was not until weeks later that her remains were discovered. The police, following a lead in another case, stumbled upon the concrete-filled drum. Inside, they found Junko's broken body, a testament to the unspeakable cruelty she endured. Even hardened investigators were shaken by the extent of her injuries. Her body was so damaged that they could scarcely list all the wounds. Burns, fractures, cuts, and bruises covered every inch of her. The sheer brutality left seasoned officers speechless. When the details of her captivity and death became public, Japan was horrified. The press called her ordeal the concrete-encased high school girl murder case, and the nation struggled to comprehend how such evil could exist among its youth. The boys responsible, Hiroshi Miyano, Joe Ogura, Yasushi Watanabe, and Nobuharu Minato, were arrested and tried, but the justice that followed was painfully inadequate. Because they were minors at the time of the crime, their sentences were shockingly light. The longest prison term handed down was just 20 years, and most of the perpetrators walked free within a decade. This miscarriage of justice enraged the public. How could anyone inflict such suffering and not face the harshest punishment? Newspapers, in defiance of legal protections, published the names of the perpetrators, declaring that men who could commit such atrocities no longer deserved anonymity. The boys lived on, some reoffending and returning to crime, while Junko's life had been stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. Her story became a symbol of both the cruelty humans are capable of and the failures of society to protect its most vulnerable. Teachers, friends, neighbors, so many people could have intervened, yet they remained silent. The horror was not only what the boys did to her, but how many others allowed it to happen. Silence, fear, and apathy enabled the crime as much as the perpetrator's violence. Even decades later, Junko Furuta's name is spoken with sorrow and anger. Her suffering has been documented in countless articles, documentaries, and discussions. For many, Her case serves as a grim reminder that evil can thrive when people look away. She was only 17, her life just beginning, when it was stolen from her in the cruelest way imaginable. What makes her story haunt us so deeply is not just the violence but the prolonged nature of it. This was not a single act of brutality, but 44 days of sustained torment. Each day she survived was another day of horror, and yet she endured until her body could no longer bear it. Her resilience in the face of such suffering is both tragic and awe-inspiring. She deserved a future, and instead, she became a victim of unimaginable cruelty. Today, the site of her death is an ordinary home. Life has continued, people walk the streets where she once walked, and yet the memory of her suffering hangs over the neighborhood like a shadow. Her story is told not only as a crime, but as a warning of what can happen when cruelty goes unchecked, when communities turn away from cries for help, and when justice fails to deliver true accountability. Junko Furuta's life was short, but her story endures as one of the most disturbing crimes in modern history. It is the kind of story that leaves scars on the collective memory, a story that cannot be forgotten no matter how much time passes. She was a girl who should have grown up to live a full life, but instead became the subject of 44 days of unimaginable pain. The haunting question remains, how could anyone allow it to happen? The truth is that Junko Furuta's case reveals the darkest corners of humanity. It shows how cruelty can escalate when there are no limits, how power and fear can silence entire communities, and how justice can sometimes fail those who need it most. Her story is more than just a tale of suffering. It is a reminder of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and courage in the face of evil. For as long as her name is remembered, so too is the warning her tragedy carries, that silence can be as deadly as violence, and that true horror often happens not in shadows, but in plain sight. In the early 1980s, Chicago was no stranger to crime. The city had long struggled with organized gangs, corruption, and violence, but nothing could have prepared it for the horrors that came to light when a group of men calling themselves a crew unleashed a wave of murders that shocked even hardened detectives. Between 1981 and 1982, 4 men, Robin Gecht, Edward Spreitzer, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokoralais, formed what later became known as the Chicago Ripper Crew. Their crimes were not ordinary killings. They were ritualistic, sadistic, and steeped in a depravity that made them some of the most terrifying murderers in American history. It began with Robin Gecht, a man who worked as a construction contractor and had once been employed by serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Gecht had a family, a wife, and children, living what appeared to be an ordinary suburban life. But beneath the surface, he was obsessed with satanic rituals and twisted fantasies. He recruited younger men, Spreitzer and the Kokoralais brothers, into his circle, feeding them bizarre beliefs and demanding loyalty. To his followers, he wasn't just a leader, he was a figure of fear and control. They were drawn into his sadistic games, which combined sexual violence with ritualistic mutilation. The crew targeted women, often sex workers, waitresses, or women walking alone at night. They would drive around in a red van, cruising the streets of Chicago in search of victims. When they spotted a woman, they lured or forced her into the van, and what followed was a nightmare. Inside that vehicle, the women were beaten, raped, and subjected to unimaginable torture. But the true horror lay in what Gecht demanded from his followers. After the assaults, he ordered them to cut off the victims' breasts. The mutilations were not random acts of cruelty, they were part of his twisted ritual. He would take the severed body parts back to his home, where he created a makeshift shrine. He forced the others to participate, making them eat pieces of flesh and perform ceremonies that he claimed were acts of satanic devotion. The killings were spread out over a year, but each one carried the same horrific signature. Victims were abducted, brutalized, mutilated, and discarded like trash. In some cases, their bodies were left in alleys, parks, or near highways, with the same grim evidence of what had been done to them. Police began to notice a pattern: women disappearing and later turning up dead with eerily similar injuries. Fear spread throughout the city. Women were terrified to walk alone at night, and rumors swirled of a cult operating in Chicago's underworld. Despite the terror, the crew operated with shocking brazenness. They attacked multiple women, sometimes only days apart, as though confident they would never be caught. For Gecht, the killings were not only about violence but about control. He manipulated his followers, convincing them that the rituals gave them power, and that mutilation was necessary to appease whatever dark forces he claimed to worship. The others, whether out of fear, loyalty, or twisted fascination, obeyed. The brutality of the attacks was staggering. Survivors who managed to escape told horrifying stories of being dragged into the van, tied up, and assaulted by multiple men. Some spoke of knives, of threats to cut off body parts, and of a leader who watched everything with cold detachment. Their testimonies painted a picture of a group that thrived on cruelty, pushing the boundaries of human depravity with each attack. The turning point came when police, piecing together witness accounts and survivor testimonies, managed to track the van and link it to the men. In 1982, they arrested Spritzer and the Kokoralais brothers, who quickly began to unravel under questioning. They confessed to their roles and pointed to Gecht as the mastermind. But while the others admitted to the mutilations and murders, Gecht denied everything. He was charged with assault in a separate case, but authorities lacked the physical evidence to tie him directly to the murders. The others did not escape justice so easily. Edward Spritzer confessed to participating in multiple killings and mutilations. Andrew and Thomas Kokoralais admitted their involvement, though each tried to minimize their role. Their statements gave police a chilling glimpse into the crew's activities. The abductions, the rituals, the shrine, and the way Gecht manipulated them. Investigators discovered that Gecht's attic contained an altar draped in black cloth, with bloodstains and evidence suggesting it had been used for ceremonies. Yet, without the victims' bodies or more concrete proof, Gecht walked away from the murder charges. He was convicted of sexual assault and battery, receiving a sentence that seemed woefully inadequate compared to the magnitude of the crimes. The others faced harsher punishment. Edward Spritzer was sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life in prison when Illinois abolished the death penalty. Andrew Kokoralais was executed by lethal injection in 1999, becoming the last man put to death in Illinois before the state formally ended capital punishment. His brother Thomas received a life sentence, though he was controversially released on parole in 2019 after serving 35 years. His release sparked outrage and fear, with many believing that a man involved in such crimes should never walk free. Even with their convictions, the true number of the Ripper Crew's victims remains uncertain. Authorities officially linked them to at least 18 murders, but some investigators believe the real number could be higher. Many women disappeared during that period, their cases unsolved, and some fit the crew's pattern. The possibility that dozens of women suffered at their hands haunts Chicago's history to this day. The case left scars not only on the victims' families, but on the entire city. It revealed how a charismatic, manipulative man like Gecht could pull others into his orbit and turn them into accomplices to unspeakable evil. It also highlighted the vulnerability of women who were often marginalized or overlooked by society. Sex workers, runaways, or women working late-night jobs, whose disappearances did not always draw immediate attention. What makes the Ripper Crew's crimes so disturbing is not just the violence but the ritualistic nature of it. The deliberate mutilation, the obsession with body parts, and the creation of a shrine turned murder into something grotesquely ceremonial. It wasn't only about killing, it was about desecration and control, about turning victims into objects for a twisted fantasy. The sheer lack of remorse shown by the men, particularly Gecht, who maintained his innocence even as evidence mounted, underscores the darkness at the heart of the case. Decades later, the Chicago Ripper Crew remains one of the most infamous groups of killers in American criminal history. Their crimes are often overshadowed by individual serial killers, but in many ways their actions were even more terrifying, because they operated as a group, feeding off one another's cruelty. Their van became a moving chamber of horrors, prowling the streets of Chicago and claiming victims in the shadows of everyday life. For the families of the victims, justice was never complete. Robin Gecht, the man believed to be the leader, never faced murder charges. His followers admitted to mutilation and killings, but without their leader's conviction, the sense of closure was incomplete. The survivors carried scars, physical and emotional, that could never fully heal. And the women who lost their lives became names in a grim tally, their final moments defined by pain and fear. Today, when people speak of the darkest crimes in Chicago's history, the Ripper Crew's name is always mentioned. Their story serves as a chilling reminder of how evil can take root in ordinary-looking men, how ritual and delusion can fuel atrocities, and how a city can be haunted by the memory of crimes too grotesque to ever forget. The red van is gone, the crew dismantled, but the echo of their crimes lingers. Crimes. The idea that a group of men once drove through the city, hunting women like prey, mutilating them in the name of some twisted belief, leaves behind a stain that cannot be erased. It is the kind of story that keeps people awake at night, wondering how such darkness could exist so close to home, and how many lives were lost before the nightmare was finally stopped.